Hello students, today I am going to discuss on demographic transition theory. Demographic transition theory is a model that describes the transformation of countries from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates as they develop economically. This theory outlines a series of stages that countries typically go through during this transition. It is a key concept in understanding population dynamics and the effects of economic development on population growth. The theory is often used to explain the population changes in developed countries and predict future demographic changing in developing nations. This theory is based on an interpretation of demographic history which was developed in 1929 by the American geographer Warren Thompson. In the 1940s and 1950s, Frank W. Notenstein developed a more formal theory of demographic transition. By 2009, the existence of a negative correlation between fertility and industrial development had become one of the most widely accepted findings in social science. As you can see through this figure, the demographic transition theory gives us the relationship between the level of economic development of a country and its demographic characteristics. Initially, there were three stages of the theory. The first stage was stage of low population growth. The second stage was stage of beginning of industrial revolution. And the third stage was stage of late industrial revolution and urban growth. In this theory, you can see that how rural agrarian economy transformed into urban industrial, and this theory widely explains this transition. Now let us discuss about the assumption of the theory. The first assumption was that population growth and level of economic development are the two faces of the same coin. Low population growth either refers very backward region or very economically and socially developed region. Third assumption was the population growth is an organic and dynamic phenomena. The model of demographic transition shows how the population growth of a country, for example, UK, as the UK recorded high quality data of demography at the time, actually changes over some time. Thus, the theory postulates a particular pattern of demographic changes from higher fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality, when society progresses from a largely rural agrarian and literally society to a dominant urban industrial and literate society. The three-way clearly stated hypotheses involved in the process. These are: the decline in mortality comes before the decline of infertility. The second is the fertility eventually declines to match the fertility. And the third is the demographic transformation of society takes place simultaneously with the socio-economic transformation of the society that are highly responsive to each other. The original theory of Thompson on the demographic transition theory were subsequently refined and reformulated with time. And now, the demographic transition theory is characterized by 5 conspicuous transition stages. So let us discuss in detail about these transition stages. The first stage, as you can see, the demographic transition model, this describes how the population of a country changes over time. It gives changes in birth and death rate and shows that country passes through 5 stages. So let us discuss about the first stage. The characteristic of the first stage is that it is high birth rate and high death rate. The population growth in this phase is very slow growth or stable population size. The example we can cite from pre-industrial societies such as those before the 18th century in Europe. Now you must be thinking, what is the reason behind that? Lack of medical knowledge, poor sanitation and high infant mortality rates keep the death rates very high. The birth rate remains high because large families are economically beneficial and necessary for survival. This stage occurs in agrarian society where the generation productivity level is very low. Large families are an asset, life expectancy is low. The development of non-agricultural sector is at its infancy stage. Masses are illiterate, technological know-how is lacking and urban development is limited. So this stage is popularly known as the pre-industrial stage. At present, it is very difficult assertion whether any country would be in the initial stage of demographic transition theory, though rare. For example, can be Ethiopian, Bangladesh, rainforest tribes, etc. Most of the developing countries of now, we are in the stage before 1760. For example, before the Industrial Revolution like UK, America, Europe and Australia, when it comes to India, India was in this stage up to the year 1921. Now let me take you to the second stage. Second stage is known as the early expanding stage. The characteristic of this stage is high birth rate but rapidly declining death rate. The population growth is characterized as rapid population growth. And we can cite the example from Sub-Sahara Africa in this context. Many developing countries are in this stage. Now you must be thinking, what is the reason behind that? Improvement in healthcare, nutrition and sanitation that reduces the death rate, but cultural and economic factor keep the birth rate still high. The second stage of demographic transition theory is characterized by a high and gradually declining fertility of over 30 per 1000 people and a sharply reduced mortality rate of over 20 per 1000 people. In this stage, the Industrial Revolution took place in UK, which significantly contributed to lowering the mortality as government started earning revenue and invested heavily in the social sector. So in this stage, demographic transition theory, while improvements in the medical stage. As the second stage prolonged, fertility also shows sign of gradual decline. As were the better medical treatment, like life expectancy starts improving, the process of industrialization and urban development became prominent. Large families are no longer remain as an asset. Consequently, fertility undergoes a gradual decline, leading to a gradual squeeze of rate of natural increase at the end of the second stage. Thus, as a whole in the second stage, the population expands first at a gradually increased rate and afterward at a gradually subsiding rate with an average natural increase of around 10 to 15% per 1000 people. So the declining share of the agriculture sector in the total GDP and growing share of the industrial sector in total GDP is a classic characteristic of second stage. Thus, this stage is popularly known as first industrial phase. Most of the Middle East countries of the world are passing through this explosive stage of demographic transition. United Kingdom was in this stage during Industrial Revolution, and India was in this stage from 1921 to 1951. So you should always remember that India was in which stage in which year. Now let me take you to the third stage, which is also known as stationary stage or late expanding stage. The characteristic of this stage is declining birth rate and low death rate. The population growth, the characteristic of this is a slowing population growth, and the countries which can be cited as an example is our own country India and Brazil. Now let me emphasize upon the reason: the economic development that leads to changes in the family size and preference, increased urbanization, and improved access to different type of methods to control the fertility, that can be one of the example. In this stage, birth rate fall rapidly to perhaps 20 per 1000 people, while death rate continues to fall slightly to 15 per 1000, leading to a slowly increasing population with a natural increase of around 0 to 5% per 1000 people. This stage is considered as second industrial phase, where the share of the industrial sector in total gross domestic product and employment opportunity through increase but a slower rate. The share of agriculture sector declines drastically and tertiary sector is on the rise. The fall in the birth rates may be due to lower IMR, which reduces the stress of having many children, increases industrialization and mechanization involving fewer laborer, improvement in the family planning aspects, increased desire for material possession such as cars, holiday, bigger homes, and less desire for large. Despite all controversy, it has a universal acceptability. For example, it can be applied for any country if proper data is available. So after discussing the third stage, let me take you to the fourth stage, which is known as the low stationary stage. Low birth rates and low death rates. This is the characteristic of this stage. The population growth is stable or very slow population growth. If I would cite example, that would be from United States, Japan, and many European nations. You must be thinking, what are the reasons? And you can correlate this with the previous stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Yes, definitely. High level of education, greater access to healthcare, and changes in societal norms reduces birth and death rates. Though the population growth is very minimum in the first and fourth stages, unlike the first stage where fertility is high and stable, mortality is high and erratic, but here mortality is low and stable. The fertility is low and fluctuating. And the set of socio-economic conditions also varies from that of first stage. Here the society is highly urbanized and the tertiary sector is on the rising. The technical know-how is abundant. Government become totally a welfare government. Deliberate control on family size are common. The literacy level and the degree of labor specialization is high. So this stage is popularly known as the post-industrial stage. The UK after 1940 showed the sign of this stage. Most of the developed countries like Germany and most of the European countries, USA, Canada, Australia, these are in this stage. The Indian state of Kerala shows the sign of this stage, whereas Tamil Nadu is in the third stage and Bihar has just completed the second stage of demographic transition theory. So when it comes to India, different states of India are passing through different stages of demographic transition theory. And last is the declining stage. The characteristic of this stage is very low birth rate, which may be below the death rates. The population growth of this stage, the characteristic is population decline or aging population. In other words, I can say that aging population is more in number compared to other stages. We can cite the examples from Germany and Japan, which are experiencing this particular stage. Now, what are the reasons behind that? Factors such as career-oriented employment, higher education, and economic pressure, these are few of the reasons for such stages. Theoretically, in the fifth stage of demographic transition theory, a country experiences loss to the overall population or negative population growth as birth rate falls slightly lower than the death rate, which results in the population decline. This stage has only been recently recognized, and there are very few countries that are considered in stage 5. Some evidences suggest that this might be occurring in several Western European countries. This occurs mainly due to an increase in non-traditional lifestyle, greater economic independence of women, the rise of individualism, and which may be due to lack of resources for future generation. Now let us discuss about this demographic transition theory. Till now I explained that what are the assumptions of the theory, what are the 5 stages of the theory, which country will fall in which stage, and what is the status of few states in India. But what the critiques have mentioned about this particular theory, let us discuss about it. The model, being Eurocentric, has considered the experience of developed countries but not the developing countries. It has been assumed that in time all countries would pass through the same 4 stages. But it seems unlikely now, as the question arises, would the countries like Africa ever become industrialized? The model has given supreme importance to industrial activities. But many countries have completed demographic transition theory based on the pastoral economy like France, Latin America, countries, etc. The model has assumed that the fall in the death rate in the second stage was the consequence of industrialization. But initially, the death rate in many British cities rose due to insanitary condition, and it began to fall just after the medical advancement. The delayed fall in the death rate in many developing countries was due to their inability to afford medical facilities. Apart from that, in many countries, the fall in the birth rate in the third stage has not been so rapid as the model suggests, and it is due to religious or political opposition to birth control. Whereas in some countries the fall was much more rapid and came earlier, like in Brazil and in China following the one-child policy. The time scale of the model, especially in several Southeast Asian countries such as Hong Kong, Malaysia, is being squashed as they developed at a much faster rate than the early industrialized countries. Conclusion: despite all controversies, it has universal applicability. For example, it can be applied to any country if proper data is available, as I mentioned earlier also. So there is a requirement of analysis of the data pertaining to the demographic transition, that what is the death rate of the country, what is the birth rate of the country, and accordingly this model can be applicable. But the question arises about the stages of that demographic transition theory. So this model is very helpful in comparing rates of population growth between different countries at a given point in time. But definitely there are certain other critiques, and there were several questions that was raised after the proposition of this theory. Some critiques I would like to discuss with you. The stage of demographic transition are not necessarily arranged in chronological order. As a result of the removal of the Social Security program, former USSR countries other than Russia suffered an increase in death rate and entered in the first stage of demographic theory's demographic transition. These are the primary points of the contention. First and foremost, this theory is founded purely on factual data or the experience of Europe, America, and Australia. Third, it is impossible to exaggerate the importance of the technological advancement, particularly in the field of medicine, in terms of their capacity to reduce mortality rates, because it also has some behavioral determination on the basis of this birth can be controlled. Fourth, it neither provides a fundamental explanation for the fertility reduction process nor identify the key variables involved. And the fifth is, it does not stipulate a timeline for a nation's progression from one stage to the next. Lastly, it does not work particularly well for the developing nations of the world, who have recently witnessed enormous population expansion as a result of a huge decline in death rates. So these are the various assumptions or questions which has been raised by the critique of this theory. Now let us discuss a bit about the application of the theory. The demographic transition theory helps policymakers and demographers understand and predict population trends, guiding decisions in areas like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. You can see that, as I mentioned in my lecture, that if we come down to taking exciting example from India, we cannot say that India is in this particular stage. But yes, we can predict that different states of India are in different stages of demographic transition theory. And as per that, the development is taking place. But still there are many assumptions that questions that rises the questions of that. Recent evidences indicate that India too is following the pattern, although with a later start and a slower pace. So now let me specifically describe about the demographic transition in India. After 1920, the death rate began to fall, but the birth rate remained high until the 1960s, creating a gap and resulting in population growth. The birth rate began to fall much later after the 1960s. But the death rate continued to fall, implying that population growth continued. With a slight decrease in population growth rate over the last decade, the gap appears to have narrowed. So clearly, India is in the midst of demographic transition, progressing from the middle to the late transition stage. Thus, India is in the midst of demographic transition with falling fertility, reducing natural growth, and the country is expected to reach a low fertility mortality replacement level in the near future. Though uncontrolled population growth is no longer an issue, the population will be much higher than it is now. India for sure will surpass China and become the most populous country before 2030. And this is a major concern for all the policymakers in India, that how we are going to create a balance between the rising population and the available resources which we have. Now in the beginning I showed you different type of bars and diagrams and the stages as per the stages. So I thought to discuss a little bit about how to construct a population pyramid, or to understand how to interpret population characteristic from a pyramid, and how to predict likely to future changes in the population. Because as I was discussing in the applicability, this demographic transition theory is applicable to predict that what can be the next stage in any country. So despite these objections and faults, the demographic transition hypothesis provides an accurate macro level generalization of world's demographic history. Observing the demographic trend in the West makes it possible to construct a generalization based on empirical evidence that explain the transition process in any nations. So when it comes to transition, you have to understand that it is from one stage to another stage. And what all are the different components or factors which actually is very important to understand and to predict these stages, the characteristic of these stages are, that is age structure, gender structure, infant mortality and child mortality. So let me discuss briefly about what are these. The age structure is the proportion of each age group in a population. This links closely to the stage a country has reached in the demographic transition model. Whereas when it comes to gender structure, the balance between the male and the female in a population, that is called as the gender structure. So small difference can tell us a great deal about a country or a city. For example, if we cite example of Haryana, you can see that the gap between a male child, between the birth rate of male child and female child is huge there compared to the different states of southern India. Now, what is infant mortality? The number of babies that die under a year of age per 1000 live birth. And what is child mortality? The number of children that die under 5 years of age per 1000 live birth. These are few most important factors which you should understand before understanding the demographic transition theory. So these are the 5 stages which I elaborated during this discussion. A population pyramid is a type of bar graph used to show the age and gender structure of a country, city or other areas based on census data. And you all may be very much aware of the Census of India. You can cite Census of India 2001, 2011. You can see that the horizontal axis is divided into either number or percentage of the population. The central vertical axis shows age categories every 10 year, every 5 year or every single year. The lower part of the pyramid is known as the base and shows the youngest section of the population. The upper age or apex shows the elderly. So that is the reason I elaborated these 4 things which you have to understand. First is age structure, second is gender structure and infant mortality and child mortality. Then only you can understand how to draw the pyramid as per the availability of data. Interpreting population pyramid tells us a great deal about a population, such as birth rates, to a lesser extent death rates, life expectancy and the level of economic development. So with this we can conclude the demographic transition theory. Although there are different questions that has to be answered, but at nutshell we can say that demographic transition theory is a theory which gives a platform through which we can predict that what in which state, in which year, which country is going to fall in which stage. At macro level, we can say that we can generalize the population of a particular country, and it is very important to predict the population of the country, to allocate the resources, to decide different policies related to that particular country and to decide the future course of action. Thank you.